This story is based on documented events from the 1831 Southampton County Slave Rebellion in Virginia. The main events and historical context are grounded in period records and official documentation. Some dialogues and specific details have been dramatized for narrative and educational purposes. Content intended for adult audiences due to the historical nature of the events. On the morning of August 22, 1831, the residents of Southampton County, Virginia awakened to unimaginable horror. For plantation overseers had been brutally dismembered at dawn, their bodies left as grisly warnings of what was to come. By sunset, 55 more white residents would be dead in what became the bloodiest slave rebellion in American history. This is the true story of Nat Turner's uprising, a story of oppression, divine visions, and the night when the enslaved rose up to claim their freedom through violence. Before we delve into this pivotal moment in American history, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because understanding our past, however difficult, is essential to understanding our present. August 1831. Southampton County, Virginia lay in the heart of the antebellum South, a patchwork of tobacco and cotton plantations worked by thousands of enslaved African Americans. The county's economy depended entirely on slave labor, with over 16,000 enslaved people outnumbering the white population by nearly 2 to 1. Among these enslaved souls was a man named Nathaniel Turner, known to his community as Nat. Born in 1800 on Benjamin Turner's plantation, Nat was unlike many of his fellow enslaved people. He had been taught to read and write by his master's son, a rare privilege that set him apart and made him a natural leader among the enslaved community. Nat Turner was more than literate. He was deeply religious, spending hours in prayer and meditation. His fellow enslaved people called him the prophet because of his ability to read and interpret the Bible, and his claims of receiving divine visions. Turner believed with absolute certainty that God had chosen him for a special purpose, to lead his people out of bondage, just as Moses had led the Israelites from Egypt. By 1831, Turner had been sold 3 times and was currently owned by Joseph Travis, a poor white farmer who treated him relatively well. But fair treatment could not erase the fundamental injustice of bondage, and Turner's visions were becoming more frequent and more urgent. The year 1831 brought signs that Turner interpreted as divine commands to action. In February, a solar eclipse darkened the skies over Southampton County, which Turner saw as God's signal that the time for liberation was approaching. Throughout the spring and summer, he shared his visions with a small circle of trusted friends, carefully building support for what he believed would be a divinely ordained uprising. The final sign came in August when another atmospheric phenomenon turned the sun a bluish-green color. To Turner, this was unmistakable proof that God wanted him to begin the work of liberation immediately. On August 13th, Turner met with his closest allies to finalize their plans for rebellion. The conspiracy was deliberately small and secretive. Turner had learned from other failed rebellions that large conspiracies were vulnerable to betrayal. His inner circle consisted of just 4 men: Henry Porter called Hark his closest friend and fellow preacher, Nelson Williams, a skilled carpenter, Sam Francis, who worked on a neighboring plantation, and Will Francis, known for his physical strength and unwavering determination. These 5 men represented the core of what would become the most successful slave rebellion in American history. They were not driven by random violence or personal revenge, but by a systematic plan to overthrow the institution of slavery in Southampton County and establish a free territory where African Americans could live without oppression. On Sunday, August 21, 1831, Turner and his conspirators held their final planning meeting in the woods near Cabin Pond. The plan was methodical and ruthless. They would begin at Joseph Travis's farm, where Turner lived, then move systematically from plantation to plantation, killing every white person they encountered while recruiting enslaved people to their cause. The strategy was based on Turner's understanding that half measures would fail. He believed that only complete and systematic elimination of white resistance would create the shock necessary to spark a territory-wide uprising. They planned to march toward Jerusalem, the county seat, where they would seize the arsenal and declare Southampton County a free territory. As darkness fell on August 21st, the conspirators made their final preparations. They armed themselves with axes, hatchets, and knives, tools that were available to enslaved people and would not arouse suspicion. Turner led them in prayer, asking God to strengthen their resolve for the terrible work ahead. The 5 men understood that they were crossing a line from which there could be no return. Slave rebellion was punishable by death in Virginia, and any uprising would bring massive retaliation against the entire African American community. But Turner had convinced them that divine providence would protect them and that their sacrifice would liberate their people from bondage. At approximately 2 a.m. on August 22, 1831, Nat Turner and his 4 conspirators approached the Travis farmhouse where Turner lived. The family was sleeping peacefully, unaware that they were about to become the first victims in a rebellion that would shock the entire nation and forever change the course of American history. Turner hesitated for a moment at the threshold, understanding the magnitude of what they were about to begin. Then, steeling himself with the conviction that he was doing God's work, he gave the signal to begin what he called the work of death. The Southampton Rebellion was about to begin, and with it, the bloodiest 48 hours in the history of American slave resistance. 2 a.m., August 22, 1831. The Travis household lay in peaceful slumber, unaware that 5 armed men were approaching through the darkness. Joseph Travis, his wife Sally, their infant son, and Putnam Moore, a teenage apprentice, were about to become the first casualties in Nat Turner's war against slavery. Turner and his men entered the house through an unlocked door, moving silently through the rooms where they had lived and worked for years. The familiarity of the space made their task both easier and more horrifying. These were people Turner knew personally, yet his divine mission demanded their deaths. The killings were swift and methodical. Using axes and hatchets, the rebels killed Joseph Travis, his wife, and Putnam Moore in their beds. But as they prepared to leave, Turner remembered the infant sleeping in its cradle. Despite the difficulty of killing a child, Turner believed that God's command was absolute. No white person could be spared if the rebellion was to succeed. Will Francis returned to complete the grisly task, ensuring that no one remained alive to raise an alarm. The Travis farm, where Turner had lived for years, became the first crime scene in what would become the deadliest slave rebellion in American history. With the Travis family dead, the rebels moved quickly to recruit additional fighters from nearby slave quarters. Their first stop was the Francis Plantation, where Sam and Will Francis lived. Here they encountered their first challenge. Not all enslaved people were willing to join the rebellion, even when presented with the opportunity for freedom. Some enslaved people on the Francis Plantation chose to hide rather than join Turner's army. Others, like Emory Evans, a free black man, refused outright to participate. This pattern would repeat throughout the rebellion. Turner's expectation that all enslaved people would spontaneously join the uprising proved overly optimistic. However, the rebels did manage to recruit several additional men, including Austin, who had lived on the Travis farm but had not been included in the original conspiracy. They also acquired horses and additional weapons, improving their mobility and striking power for the attacks to come. By dawn on August 22, Turner's force had grown to approximately 15 men. They had also developed a more efficient system of operation. While the core group moved to each plantation house to eliminate the white residents, other rebels would go to the slave quarters to recruit additional fighters and gather weapons and supplies. Throughout the morning of August 22, Turner's army moved methodically from plantation to plantation in their immediate neighborhood. At each farm, they followed the same brutal pattern: kill every white person they found, recruit willing enslaved people, and gather weapons and supplies before moving to the next target. The rebels struck the Reese plantation next, killing the entire family and adding more fighters to their ranks. Then they moved to the home of Mrs. Piety Reese, Turner's former owner, where they killed her and several other white residents. The methodical nature of the attacks demonstrated that this was not random violence but a carefully planned military operation. By midday, the rebels had attacked more than a dozen homes and killed approximately 30 white residents. Their numbers had grown to nearly 60 fighters, and they were moving with increasing confidence toward their ultimate objective, the county seat of Jerusalem, where they planned to seize the arsenal and declare Southampton County free territory. The rebellion was proceeding exactly as Turner had envisioned in his divine visions. White resistance had been minimal, and panic was spreading throughout the county as word of the uprising reached other plantations and the town of Jerusalem. Among the most targeted victims during the rebellion were the plantation overseers, white men whose job was to supervise enslaved workers and maintain discipline through violence and intimidation. These men represented the daily face of oppression for most enslaved people, and Turner's army showed them no mercy. At the Rebecca Vaughn plantation, the rebels encountered the overseer attempting to organize a defense. He was quickly overwhelmed and killed, along with Rebecca Vaughn herself and several other white residents. The systematic elimination of overseers served both practical and symbolic purposes. It removed potential military resistance while targeting the men most directly responsible for the daily brutality of slavery. The most brutal killings occurred at the Levi Waller farm, where the rebels discovered a school for white children in session. When Waller attempted to organize the children's defense, Turner's army showed no mercy, killing Waller's wife and 10 children along with the plantation overseer. This attack would later become one of the most controversial aspects of the rebellion, as even some abolitionists struggled to justify the killing of children. The Southampton Rebellion reveals the terrible complexity of resistance against oppression. If you're finding this historical account compelling, please give this video a thumbs up to help preserve these crucial stories from American history. By 2 p.m. on August 22, Turner's rebellion had achieved remarkable success. Nearly 40 white residents of Southampton County were dead. The rebels' numbers had grown to approximately 60 fighters, and panic was spreading throughout the region. Local militias were beginning to mobilize, but Turner's army remained confident in their divine mission and their ability to reach Jerusalem. However, the rebellion was about to face its first serious military resistance. Word of the uprising had reached white communities throughout the region, and armed groups were converging on Southampton County to crush the rebellion. The next few hours would determine whether Turner's divine visions would lead to liberation or to one of the bloodiest repressions in American history. The stage was set for the climactic confrontation between Turner's Army of Liberation and the forces of the slave system that had oppressed African Americans for more than 2 centuries. August 22, 1831, 3 p.m. News of the Southampton Rebellion had spread like wildfire throughout southeastern Virginia and into North Carolina. Church bells were ringing alarm signals, and horsemen were racing between plantations warning of the uprising. What had begun as a localized rebellion was now threatening to become a regional catastrophe for the slave system. Turner's army, now numbering approximately 60 fighters, was marching confidently toward Jerusalem when they encountered their first organized resistance. A group of 18 white men led by Alexander Pete had positioned themselves at the Parker Plantation, directly in the rebels' path. The confrontation at Parker's farm marked the turning point of the rebellion. For the first time, Turner's fighters faced armed white men who were prepared for battle rather than sleeping families caught by surprise. The rebels charged the white position with their usual ferocity, but the dynamics of the conflict had fundamentally changed. The white defenders were equipped with superior weapons, rifles and pistols, rather than the axes and farm tools that comprised most of the rebels' arsenal. More importantly, they were fighting from prepared positions and had the advantage of military training that most enslaved people lacked. Despite their numerical advantage, Turner's army was repulsed at Parker's farm. Several rebels were killed or wounded, and for the first time since the rebellion began, they were forced to retreat. This defeat shattered the aura of invincibility that had sustained the rebels through their morning of victories. More seriously, the failed attack at Parker's farm demonstrated to other enslaved people in the area that Turner's army was not unstoppable. The divine protection that Turner had promised was proving insufficient against organized white resistance, and recruitment of new fighters became more difficult. Turner attempted to regroup his forces and continue toward Jerusalem, but the momentum of the rebellion had been broken. White resistance was stiffening throughout the county, and reports were arriving of large numbers of armed whites converging on Southampton County from neighboring regions. By evening on August 22, Turner's army had been reduced to approximately 40 fighters. Some rebels had been killed or captured. Others had deserted when they realized the rebellion was not achieving the swift victory Turner had promised. As Turner's rebellion faltered, the white response was growing into a massive military operation. Governor John Floyd had mobilized the Virginia militia, and federal troops from the USS Natchez and USS Warren in Norfolk were marching toward Southampton County. Additionally, militia units from North Carolina were crossing the border to assist in suppressing the rebellion. The scale of the white response revealed how deeply the rebellion had shaken the foundations of the slave system. By August 23, more than 3,000 armed white men were converging on Southampton County, a force large enough to fight a small war. But the organized military response was only part of the white retaliation. Throughout the region, armed white mobs were killing any African American they encountered, regardless of whether they had participated in the rebellion. The violence was indiscriminate and brutal, with some victims beheaded and their heads mounted on poles as warnings to other enslaved people. This reign of terror would ultimately claim the lives of more than 120 African Americans, most of whom had nothing to do with Turner's rebellion. The white response demonstrated that the slave system would defend itself through whatever level of violence was necessary. On the morning of August 23, Turner made his last attempt to salvage the rebellion. With only about 20 fighters remaining, he attacked a small group of white militiamen near the Belmont Plantation. This final engagement ended in complete defeat for the rebels, with most of Turner's remaining army killed or scattered. Turner himself managed to escape into the dismal swamp, where he would remain hidden for more than 2 months. His rebellion had lasted less than 48 hours, but in that brief time it had achieved something unprecedented in American history: a successful slave uprising that struck terror into the heart of the slave system. The immediate aftermath of the rebellion's collapse was characterized by extraordinary brutality against the African American community. White militias and vigilante groups killed suspected rebels without trial, and the heads of executed slaves were mounted on poles along roads throughout Southampton County. A road in the area became known as Blackhead Signpost Road because of the gruesome displays. The level of violence was so extreme that even some white leaders became concerned about the economic impact of killing valuable slave property. General Richard Epps eventually issued orders to halt the indiscriminate killing, noting that the uncontrolled violence was destroying valuable assets. While his followers were being captured or killed, Nat Turner remained at large in the swamps and forests of Southampton County. A massive manhunt was organized, with rewards offered for his capture dead or alive. For more than 2 months, Turner evaded capture by hiding in caves, hollow trees, and other concealed locations near the scene of his rebellion. Turner's ability to remain hidden for so long demonstrated his intimate knowledge of the local terrain and possibly the assistance of enslaved people who remained sympathetic to his cause despite the failure of the rebellion. His continued freedom kept white fears alive and prevented the complete restoration of order in Southampton County. The collapse of Turner's rebellion marked the end of the bloodiest slave uprising in American history, but its effects were only beginning to be felt. 55 white residents of Southampton County had been killed, while more than 120 African Americans had died in the white retaliation that followed. The rebellion had achieved Turner's goal of shocking the slave system and forcing a national conversation about slavery. But it had also triggered a massive backlash that would make life even more difficult for enslaved and free African Americans throughout the South. The final reckoning of Turner's rebellion was yet to come. October 30, 1831. For more than 2 months, Nat Turner had been the most wanted man in America. Rewards totaling $1,100, an enormous sum for the time, had been offered for his capture. Despite the massive manhunt involving thousands of armed men, Turner had managed to remain hidden in the forests and swamps near the scene of his failed rebellion. Turner's ability to evade capture had become a source of continuing terror for white residents of Southampton County. As long as the rebellion's leader remained free, the possibility of renewed uprising could not be dismissed. His continued freedom also served as a powerful symbol for enslaved people throughout the region, proof that even the most wanted fugitive could outwit the slave system's pursuit. Turner had survived by using caves, hollow trees, and other natural hiding places in the dense forests near Cross Keys. He had occasionally received food and assistance from enslaved people who remained sympathetic to his cause, though such help became increasingly dangerous as the manhunt intensified. The psychological pressure of constant pursuit had taken its toll on Turner. Weakened by months of inadequate food and shelter, he had grown increasingly desperate. On October 30th, that desperation would lead to the mistake that finally brought his freedom to an end. Turner's downfall came when hunger drove him to approach a farm owned by Salathiel Francis, one of his original supporters. Turner had hoped to obtain food and possibly reconnect with surviving members of his network, but he had underestimated how thoroughly the white authorities had intimidated the local African American community. As Turner approached the Francis farm, he was spotted by Benjamin Phipps, a local white farmer who was armed with a shotgun. Phipps recognized Turner immediately from the detailed descriptions that had been circulated throughout the region. Turner was caught completely by surprise and had no opportunity to escape. Weakened by months of hiding and inadequate nutrition, he was unable to offer any resistance when Phipps captured him at gunpoint. The most successful slave rebel in American history had finally been brought to earth by hunger and desperation. Phipps immediately transported Turner to the county jail in Jerusalem, where news of his capture spread rapidly throughout the region. After more than 2 months of freedom, the prophet of the Southampton Rebellion was finally in custody and facing certain execution. While awaiting trial in the Southampton County Jail, Turner was interviewed extensively by Thomas Ruffin Gray, a local white lawyer who had been involved in defending other accused rebels. Gray recognized the historical significance of Turner's rebellion and saw an opportunity to create a valuable document by recording Turner's own account of the uprising. Over several days, Gray conducted detailed interviews with Turner, recording what became known as the Confessions of Nat Turner. This document would become one of the most important primary sources for understanding the Southampton Rebellion and the mindset of its leader. In his confessions, Turner showed no remorse for the killings and maintained that he had been acting on divine orders. He described in detail how his religious visions had convinced him that God wanted him to lead his people out of bondage through violence. Turner's calm acceptance of his fate and his continued belief in his divine mission impressed even his captors. Turner admitted to personally killing only one person during the rebellion, Margaret Whitehead, a young white woman who had escaped the initial attack on her family but was later caught and killed by Turner himself. This confession would become crucial evidence in his trial. On November 5, 1831, Nat Turner was brought before the Southampton County Court of Oyer and Terminer to face charges of conspiracy and murder. The trial was a foregone conclusion. No court in Virginia in 1831 would acquit a slave rebel who had led the killing of 55 white people. Despite the predetermined outcome, Turner's trial was conducted according to legal procedures of the time. He was provided with legal counsel and allowed to present a defense, though his own confessions made acquittal impossible. Turner's demeanor during the trial impressed observers with his calm dignity and unshakable belief in the righteousness of his cause. He showed no fear of death and maintained that he had been fulfilling God's will in leading the rebellion. His conviction and death sentence surprised no one, but his courage in the face of execution earned grudging respect even from his enemies. The trial lasted only one day, reflecting both the strength of the evidence against Turner and the urgency white authorities felt about resolving the case. The Southampton Rebellion's leader would not be allowed to become a long-term symbol of resistance through prolonged legal proceedings. Nat Turner's trial marked the end of one of the most significant challenges to American slavery. If you're learning something from this crucial historical account, please hit that like button and share this story with others who value understanding our complex past. On November 11, 1831, Nat Turner was hanged in Jerusalem before a crowd of white spectators who had gathered to witness the execution of America's most famous slave rebel. Even in death, Turner maintained his dignity and his conviction that he had been doing God's work in leading the rebellion. After the hanging, Turner's body was subjected to additional indignities that reflected white fears about his potential to inspire future rebellions. His body was skinned and his flesh was rendered into grease, while his skeleton was divided among souvenir hunters. These brutal treatments of Turner's corpse demonstrated the continuing terror that his rebellion had inspired among white Southerners. Turner's execution marked the official end of the Southampton Rebellion, but its effects would continue to reverberate throughout American society for decades to come. The rebellion had demonstrated that enslaved people were capable of organized resistance on a scale that threatened the entire slave system, forcing a national reckoning with the institution of slavery. With Nat Turner's death, the immediate crisis of the Southampton Rebellion was resolved, but its deeper implications were just beginning to be understood. The rebellion had shattered white assumptions about slave contentment and demonstrated the potential for organized resistance that had always existed within the slave system. The trials and executions that followed Turner's capture would claim the lives of 18 additional rebels, while hundreds of other African Americans had already died in the white retaliation that followed the rebellion. But the ideas that had driven Turner's uprising, the conviction that slavery was morally wrong and that enslaved people had the right to fight for their freedom, could not be executed along with the rebels. The Southampton Rebellion had planted seeds of both fear and hope that would grow until they finally bore fruit in the American Civil War 30 years later. The Southampton Rebellion's impact extended far beyond the 55 white deaths and the execution of its leaders. In the months following Turner's capture, Virginia and other southern states passed a wave of new laws designed to prevent future uprisings by further restricting the lives of both enslaved and free African Americans. These black codes prohibited enslaved people from learning to read and write, banned them from holding religious meetings without white supervision, and severely restricted their movement between plantations. The literacy that had made Turner so effective as a leader was now seen as an unacceptable danger to the slave system. Free African Americans faced even harsher restrictions, as white authorities recognized that Turner's rebellion had been inspired partly by examples of successful resistance in Haiti and other locations where enslaved people had won their freedom. Many free blacks were forced to leave Virginia entirely, while those who remained faced constant surveillance and harassment. The rebellion also triggered a brief but significant debate in the Virginia legislature about the possibility of gradual emancipation. For several weeks in early 1832, Virginia lawmakers seriously considered a plan to gradually eliminate slavery from the state, recognizing that the institution created an ongoing threat to white safety. Turner's rebellion forced Americans throughout the country to confront the fundamental contradictions of a nation founded on principles of liberty while maintaining millions of people in bondage. Northern abolitionists pointed to the rebellion as proof that slavery was not only morally wrong but practically unsustainable in a society that claimed to value freedom. Southern defenders of slavery responded by arguing that the rebellion proved the need for even stricter control over the enslaved population. They claimed that Turner's literacy and religious education had made him dangerous, using his example to justify laws prohibiting the education of enslaved people. The rebellion also influenced the growing abolition movement by demonstrating that enslaved people were willing to risk everything for freedom. While some abolitionists condemned the violence of Turner's methods, others argued that enslaved people had the same right to violent resistance that American colonists had claimed against British rule. The Southampton Rebellion thus became a crucial element in the national debate over slavery that would eventually lead to the Civil War. Turner's example proved that the slave system could not be maintained indefinitely without constant vigilance and increasing repression. The memory of Nat Turner's rebellion continued to haunt the American South for decades after 1831. Every rumor of slave unrest, every unexplained fire, every act of resistance by enslaved people was interpreted through the lens of Southampton County. The rebellion had created a permanent state of anxiety among white Southerners that could never be completely resolved as long as slavery existed. This ongoing fear influenced every aspect of Southern society, from the design of plantation houses to the organization of slave patrols. The rebellion had demonstrated that the slave system's greatest weakness was not external attack, but internal resistance by the people it oppressed. Turner's rebellion also inspired future generations of African American resistance fighters. During the Civil War, many formerly enslaved people who joined the Union Army explicitly cited Turner's example as inspiration for their own fight for freedom. His willingness to die for the cause of liberation made him a powerful symbol for all who opposed slavery. The rebellion's influence extended beyond American borders as well. International opponents of slavery pointed to Southampton County as evidence that enslaved people everywhere would resist bondage when given the opportunity. Turner's rebellion thus became part of a global movement against human bondage. Modern historians recognize the Southampton Rebellion as a turning point in American history that forced the nation to confront the inherent violence of the slave system. Turner's uprising demonstrated that slavery could not be maintained without constant brutality and repression, making clear the moral bankruptcy of the institution. The rebellion also revealed the extraordinary courage and determination of enslaved people who were willing to risk everything for freedom. Despite facing overwhelming odds and certain death if captured, Turner and his followers chose to fight rather than accept permanent bondage. Perhaps most importantly, the Southampton Rebellion helped to shape the national conversation about slavery that would eventually lead to emancipation. By demonstrating that enslaved people would never voluntarily accept their condition, Turner forced white Americans to choose between maintaining slavery through increasing violence or abandoning the institution entirely. The rebellion thus stands as a crucial moment in the long struggle for African American freedom that culminated in the Civil War and the 13th Amendment. Turner's vision of divine liberation would eventually be fulfilled, though not in the way he had imagined. The Southampton Rebellion continues to raise difficult questions about resistance, violence, and justice that remain relevant today. Turner's willingness to kill innocent people, including children, in pursuit of liberation challenges simple narratives about good and evil in the struggle against oppression. Some historians argue that Turner's methods were justified by the extreme brutality of slavery and the impossibility of achieving freedom through peaceful means. Others contend that the killing of non-combatants, regardless of the cause, cannot be morally justified. These debates reflect broader questions about the ethics of violent resistance against oppressive systems. Turner's rebellion forces us to consider what methods are acceptable in the struggle for fundamental human rights, and whether violent resistance can ever be morally justified when peaceful change seems impossible. The Southampton Rebellion thus remains not just a historical event but a continuing challenge to our understanding of justice, resistance, and the price of freedom in an imperfect world. The story of Nat Turner and the Southampton Rebellion reminds us that the struggle for human freedom has always required enormous courage and sacrifice. If this historical account has deepened your understanding of this crucial period in American history, please share it with others and subscribe for more stories that illuminate our complex past. On November 11, 1831, when Nat Turner was executed in Jerusalem, Virginia, he believed that his rebellion had failed. He could not have known that his actions would help set in motion the events that would eventually destroy the slave system he had died fighting against. Turner's rebellion proved that enslaved people would never willingly accept bondage, and that the slave system could only be maintained through increasing violence and repression. By forcing this recognition upon white Americans, the Southampton Rebellion helped create the conditions that would eventually lead to the Civil War and emancipation. The rebellion also demonstrated the power of conviction and courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Turner and his followers knew they were likely to die, but they chose to fight anyway because they believed that freedom was worth any sacrifice. Their example continues to inspire all who struggle against oppression and injustice. Today, visitors to Southampton County can see historical markers that commemorate both the white victims of the rebellion and the enslaved people who died in its aftermath. These memorials remind us that the fight for human freedom has always come at a terrible cost, paid by both those who resisted and those who were caught in the violence that resistance sometimes requires. The Southampton Rebellion stands as one of the most significant challenges to American slavery and a crucial moment in the long struggle for African American freedom. Nat Turner's vision of divine liberation may have seemed like failure in 1831, but history would eventually vindicate his belief that no people will remain enslaved forever. This narrative is based on documented events from the 1831 Southampton County Slave Rebellion. The main events, participants, and outcomes are historically accurate, though some dialogue and specific details have been dramatized for narrative purposes. The rebellion's impact on American history and the abolition movement is well documented in historical records.